According to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and its over 57,000 members, abortion is an essential component of women's health care. Abortion is health care. When we criminalize, excuse me, Mr. Chair, I would like the ability to answer my question line. When we criminalize health care, undermine a patient's ability. Thank you very much.
Please, we'll have order.
I rise in favor of my amendment, which would prohibit federal funding for the countering group extremist activity working or implement any recommendations from the group. In 2021, Democrats and the Biden regime unjustly used January 6th to prop up this woke working group to provide cover for unjustly targeting members of our military. Under the Biden regime, DEI instruction and management has reached new heights that threaten to weaken the bond between America's armed forces and its civilian leadership and undermine our military effectiveness and readiness. All of our men and women in uniform deserve to have the best tools needed to carry out their mission to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Unfortunately, liberal ideology undermines this mission. In order to stand up to China, Russia, terrorists, our military needs to project strength, not cultural wokeness.
Mr. Chair, to be clear, January 6th was an attack on America, our democracy, and this institution which we have all taken an oath to serve. This shouldn't be controversial, but service members who swear an oath to the Constitution should not try to overthrow the United States government. My colleagues allege that the department's efforts to counter extremist activities unfairly targets conservatives. There's nothing in the Countering Extremist Activity Working Group's final report to substantiate that allegation, because violent extremism, regardless of its political or partisan leaning, is a danger to all of us and to this democracy. But there can be no denial that far-right extremism is surging across the country at a much higher level than that of left-wing extremism. A recent study showed that violent extremist acts in the United States were far more likely to be associated with far-right ideologies like white supremacy than for any far-left alternative. In fact, the level of violence perpetrated by right-wing extremists in this country is on par with, if not higher than, that of Islamist extremists. In our country, where service members have access to critical national security information and assets, individuals motivated by extremist ideologies can pose an outside threat to our national security when they move beyond fair and legal expression of contentious issues and into subversive or even violent actions.
Our military's focus should be the protection of the American people and our freedoms, not liberals' feelings. Therefore, my amendment would eliminate any offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the armed forces and the Department of Defense. We should not be spending our hard-earned tax dollars to focus on diversity of ideas. We should be focusing on diversity of ideas and opinions, not races and genders. DEI programs tend to be effective, and the cost to the taxpayer is spending more money that we don't have. To sum this up, a woke military is a weak military.
You know, I don't get this whole woke reference, but I'm definitely awake after what I have heard on this floor today. During our markup, we heard repeatedly that the PRC and Russia, even today we heard it, they weren't spending their troops' time on DEI. And I absolutely agree with you. They aren't. The strongest military possible, the one we aim to be, the one we are, is a diverse, equitable, and inclusive one. When you compare our military with those of our competitors, what is immediately striking is the diversity of our service members. Studies have long shown and demonstrated that diversity helps organizations out-innovate, outperform, out-strategize, out-maneuver others. Our diversity is our strength. Our commitment to equality, to inclusiveness, that is what makes us American. It is why we have the very best military in the world. But some House Republicans insist on peddling a false choice between DEI and readiness. Why are they so keen on emulating and becoming more like the PRC, more like Russia? Eliminating DEI won't help our military compete more effectively with the PRC. It will, however, undermine the innovative thinking, the cultural competency, the inclusive institutional cultures, the qualitative edge, our ability to win if we need to be agile and ready and lethal. This amendment to terminate DEI officers and personnel and all of the insidious DEI-related amendments we have had to hear and will hear tonight by my Republican colleagues aren't just harmful to our national security, they are a major threat. It is time we set aside the political games that we are seeing and get serious about our national security and stand by our servicemen and women of all backgrounds who have given up so much in defense of our country and to keep all of us safe.
The so-called countering group extremist activity working has been weaponized and implemented to almost exclusively target Republicans, conservatives, and libertarians serving in the military. And yet, by its own metrics, it has been a massive waste of money and time. The Defense Department continues to spend large amounts of time and money to combat extremism, yet its own analysis of the situation shows that it's entirely unnecessary. In fact, fewer than 100 service members have been subject to the discipline due to engagement in extremist activities. That's only 0.005% of the approximately 2.1 million active and reserve personnel. Clearly, extremism is not the problem that my colleagues on the left and media outlets made it out to be. The United States military is tasked with one mission: maintaining mission-critical readiness to protect the American homeland. Sowing our armed forces with divisive rhetoric designed to pit races and genders against one another is not only morally wrong, it poses a very real threat to our national security.
Yet the latest report from the Department of Defense Inspector General found that 78 service members were alleged to have advocated for the overthrow of the government in the past year alone. That is likely an undercount given reported challenges in gathering and compiling data across the military departments. Clearly, extremism in the military remains a persistent and serious issue, one that we should not take lightly, again, given the January 6th insurrection in which we know some service members and veterans participated. This fact alone should be deeply concerning to every single one of us in this chamber. Instead of taking this problem seriously, this amendment prohibits the Department of Defense from implementing recommendations designed to counter extremist activity in our military. This undermines unit cohesion, the readiness of our forces, and ultimately public trust in our military. Tackling extremism in our military is not about promoting wokeness, which my colleagues continue to be obsessed about. It's about protecting our people and our country. And that, sadly, also means preventing domestic terrorism and addressing the serious and persistent threat to our homeland. And is also about restoring public confidence and trust in one of the most important institutions in our history and society. I urge my colleagues to reject this dangerous amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise today in support of my amendment that would restrict radical gender ideology and pornographic content from entering the libraries and classrooms of school operated by the Department of Defense. These morally corrupting materials have no place in an educational setting and could seriously harm the educational and psychological development of school children belonging to our service members. Oftentimes, DoD schools are the only option the service members have to educate their children, and we must ensure they have the resources to prepare them for success in their future careers in society. Yet radical leftists desire to use schools as a tool to indoctrinate our children as soon as they enter kindergarten. I wish they were all just theoretical, but there exists a litany of examples of inappropriate and pornographic material that is available in DoD schools. Much of the material is far too graphic for me to read verbatim here on the House floor, but one example includes the book Gender Queer, which includes explicit imagery of sexual acts. In some DoD middle schools, young children are able to access a book called Middle School's A-Drag, which is a story about a 12-year-old boy who starts a talent agency for child drag queen performers.
Madam Chair, as the mother of 2 teenage boys in public schools, I understand and can appreciate the need for age-appropriate content to ensure our schools remain nurturing environments for our kids. But the kinds of content that make it into these curricula and classrooms are decisions best left to professional educators working together with parents to determine what is best for our students. And as a mom, it is important our children see themselves and the situations they face in the books they read and the curriculum they are taught. This amendment is yet another attempt to broadly ban entire categories of books, forcing educators to second-guess and censor themselves. Engaging with novel and challenging topics topics is essential to how kids grow as students and individuals. They need to be able to confront ideas and topics that may not always be comfortable to them. This amendment is simply terrible policy in terms of providing our kids with the education they need to succeed in a complex and rapidly evolving world. Ultimately, at its core, this is discriminatory and offensive amendment in its targeting of our LGBTQ+ people. It separates military children attending DODEA schools, some of whom may identify as LGBTQ+ themselves, from their peers in other school systems in the United States, isolating them and depriving their education of perspectives critical to their own self-identification, growth, and development. This amendment makes it harder for DODEA teachers and counselors to support students with the materials they need if they question their gender identities or sexual orientations. This is an unwelcome intrusion on the trust between students and their teachers and counselors who can play important roles for military children often moving from place to place at formative times in their life. Eliminating the ability for educators to provide resources and guides to help our military youth with complicated decisions and feelings that they have. This is absolutely unacceptable. I have had conversations with young people back at home who shared serious concerns about the impact of censorship of LGBTQ+ content in their schools on the mental health of themselves and their peers. This amendment would further that sense of isolation and lead to increased rates of depression and, tragically, as we have seen, suicidal ideation. This amendment also sends a deeply hurtful and wrong message to LGBTQ+ service members, some of whom may have children attending DODEA schools, about what this Congress and our government thinks about them and their loved ones. This amendment dishonors their service and commitment to our country. We know that the people most hurt by book bans are ultimately students and kids, and this amendment undermines the quality of education and experience that military children receive at our DODEA schools. It is reckless, discriminatory, and it's an attack on our LGBTQ+ students and their service members. As a mom, I think of all of our children who deserve to feel supported and included, seen in our educational system. For these reasons, I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
My amendment would prohibit CRT training for employees of the Department of Defense or members of the Air Force. The primary focus of our military should be mission readiness and lethality. Unfortunately, many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have continued to push for diversity, equity, and inclusion to the deficit of our servicemen and women. Divisive ideologies like CRT have no place in our military. Our service members should be learning the critical and often life-saving skills that help them and their fellow service members stay alive when they are deployed, rather than having training hours diverted to force CRT and race-based training. To say that the military isn't actively doing this is, I think, misleading. In fact, I personally have seen training that our service members, to include my husband, have had to go through. To put it in perspective, my husband, before he was actually, he got out of the military, was made to write down the top 5 people he associated with, writing down their race, sexual orientation, and gender. And if those people were not diverse enough, he was then racist. Well, I have news for my colleagues across the aisle. When you have men and women deploying around the country, serving with black and brown people, since that's apparently what we are going to talk in regards to color, around the world, and you are telling them that they are racist even though they have laid down their lives for these people, I think that just shows how out of touch this governing body is.
Mr. Chair, once again, it appears my colleagues fail to understand what critical race theory is. Critical race theory helps us understand the past, while DEI, as they've often been against, helps us chart the path forward to acknowledge and rectify the systemic racism that still shapes the present. But let's not conflate or confuse the two. So let me reiterate, critical race theory is simply an academic and legal framework to recognize that systemic racism is part of our nation's history. Yes, that is hard to hear, but sadly, that is absolutely the fact and the case. And that this systemic racism continues, quite frankly, to affect our society and individuals in it to this very day. These are hard truths for my colleagues that cannot bear to hear it. But there is no other way to explain the compromise enshrined for almost 80 years in our Constitution that counted slaves as 3/5 of a person to determine matters like the number of seats allotted to states for this very body, the House of Representatives. There's no other way to explain the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Asian Exclusion Act, which banned immigration of Asian people to this country for decades. Nor is there any other way to justify the grave historical injustices of Executive Order 9066 that interned over 100,000 Japanese Americans during the Second World War, including my great-grandfather, who was locked up against his will in Santa Fe, New Mexico, while my grandfather, his son, son served in the military intelligence service for a country who saw and treated him and his loved ones as the enemy. Systemic racism is a part of the history of our military, the Department of Defense, and this country. There's no other way to explain the fact that even though they served bravely in the Revolutionary War, black men were formally excluded from military service after the war until the Civil War. Meanwhile, Filipino veterans of World War II waited for over 4 decades for the citizenship and benefits promised to them for their service under our flag and are still waiting till this day. If my Republican colleagues believe we can compete with our adversaries across the globe by avoiding these truths, they are sadly wrong. While our adversaries will seek to whitewash and erase histories like that of the Ukrainians, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, we must do better, we should be better, because this speaks to who we are as a union. Having our service members learn about...
I yield the gentlelady an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you. Having our service members learn about systemic racism and think critically about the role it continues to play in our society may make some of them uncomfortable, but it is not going to make them hate America. It will, however, help them understand why inequities persist in our country, including in the ranks of our military. I hope it will remind them how far we've come and how much further we must go towards a more equitable future, one in which they, regardless of their background, can achieve their fullest potential. We need to understand critical race theory for what it is, an opportunity for us to confront our past and work towards a better future. For that reason, I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time back.
The entire premise of this hearing is the erosion of the doctor-patient relationship as a result of politicians telling doctors how they should treat their patients. So let's talk about that. It is truly hypocritical that my Republican colleagues are convening a hearing on government overreach into the doctor-patient relationship when their party is literally writing the playbook across our country on how to do exactly that, all while endangering the lives of 25 million women by denying them access to abortions and forcing doctors to break their Hippocratic oath to do no harm when government denies them the ability to provide their patients with the care and treatment they need. Since the right-wing majority of the Supreme Court overturned Roe, extreme Republican lawmakers have been tripping over themselves to pass dangerous bans and restrictions, defying the will of the majority of Americans. According to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and its over 57,000 members, abortion is an essential component of women's health care. Abortion is health care. When we criminalize, excuse me, Mr. Chair, I would like the ability to answer my question line. When we criminalize health care, undermine a patient's ability. Thank you very much.
Please, we'll have order, and I
you.
will expect that Ms. Tokuda has her right to make her comments.
I
Everyone
appreciate-
will get their time.
Thank you. I hope so. When we criminalize healthcare, undermine a patient's ability to access healthcare, tell doctors how they should and should not treat their patients, we have failed. Dr. Chain, yes or no? Do abortion bans undermine and erode the doctor-patient relationship?
Yes.
Since Dobbs took effect, we have heard horrific stories of patients enduring life-threatening situations and unthinkable emotional trauma before doctors felt they could legally provide care. The far right's war on abortion is a direct attack on 1 in every 4 women in the United States that have received abortion care, and an assault and infringement on every single person's ability to obtain the health care they need in consultation with their health care providers. And these draconian bans have devastating consequences on all of our communities. Longitudinal studies have shown us that denying access to abortion care increased household poverty, subjected individuals to long-term financial distress, bankruptcies, and even evictions. Women denied this most basic health care were often more likely to stay in violent relationships, were often left raising their children alone, and in the most tragic cases, suffered serious health problems and life-threatening complications. Dr. Shane, simple yes or no, does banning basic health care, such as abortion care, harm patients?
Yes.
When abortion is banned, it severely limits a provider's ability to provide their patients with timely, high-quality access to care. It directly undermines and erodes the relationship between patients and medical professionals, and even worse, puts patients' lives at risk. Dr. Shane, do these consequences pose an even greater threat to the doctor-patient relationship than pandemic-era public health policies like COVID-19 vaccine requirements?
Yes, they absolutely do.
As we see a rise even right now in COVID cases throughout our country and even in the halls of Congress, I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to think long and hard about this subcommittee's priorities. We've spent the last 2 hours discussing baseless, hypocritical allegations of interference in the doctor-patient relationship during the pandemic. All the while, we have Republicans systemically damaging the doctor-patient relationship by criminalizing basic reproductive health care and inflicting harm on millions of women across our country. I yield back. Thank you very much. You know, taking a look at the testimony, I appreciate all of you being here today. We do see that there is an increase in AA and HPI recruitment. Hawaii, where I represent, is actually one of the hotspots historically for recruitment, where you have a significant number coming from our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities. Now, according to the military's Workplace Equal Opportunity Survey from 2017, almost a quarter of Asian American servicemen reported racial or ethnic harassment or discrimination. My question to you is, during the pandemic, our country witnessed a significant rise in AAPI hate and discrimination incidences. Has there been an updated survey done post-pandemic that has tracked to see if this is the same case with our military servicemen and women?
The discrimination that's been taking place amongst our AAPI community throughout the country because of the COVID pandemic was just unacceptable and very unfortunate. But I will tell you, I have not received, since I've been the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, since I've been the Undersecretary for Personnel Readiness, I have not come across any cases within the Department of Defense where I've seen any cases of discrimination based on that.
Okay, well, sir, it was more than unfortunate. We're talking about lives being in danger. We're talking about discrimination and hate racism in our country. And in fact, if in 2017, before the pandemic, when we were talking about COVID, and we had things like Kung Flu being flung out from the highest offices of this country, you already had 1 in 4 service members of color, of AAPI background, saying that they felt intimidated, felt discrimination. I can only imagine that would have increased. So are you telling me that you have never heard of any incidences of AAPI hate, discrimination taking place in the last 2.5 years, when we have literally seen people beaten in our streets?
If you're talking in general across the United States,
I'm
yes,
talking about
I
within
have,
the service,
within
sir.
the Department of the Military, I have not come across, or none have been open to me, where people have been discriminated or put in a situation to where they
Clearly, you folks have not updated the survey. I would humbly ask that if we did this survey in 2017 and we saw a trend where 1 in 4 members felt discrimination at this time, felt ethnic harassment, then I would guess that we should be doing a follow-up survey disaggregated by ethnicity so we can see across the board where is discrimination and harassment taking place? What are we doing to actually address this? I want to move on to my next question, still somewhat related. As we focus our attention now on strategic competition with China, combating anti-AA and HPI hate, bias, discrimination, and xenophobia is not just going to be about protecting the civil rights of our people. It's also going to be a strategic imperative. Now, DEI initiatives help combat anti-AA and HPI hate and discrimination and should be creating a welcoming and attractive environment that can draw the best talent and workforce to the department and enhance our competitive edge with China. We need people that have critical language and cultural understanding to meet the demands in this vastly diverse Indo-Pacific region, right on the edge of my district, and that includes China, because competition is not just about the assets and capabilities we can field, but also, more importantly, the strategies and doctrines we employ. To succeed in that requires the empathy to understand both the culture and the philosophy that define the way our strategic competitors think and perceive the world. It's hard to be able to do that and acquire that without strong AAPI representation in our military and especially in its senior leadership. We know that this works. One only has to look back to World War II. My grandfather was in the military intelligence service. Thanks to these brave men, we know for a fact that the war was shortened and lives were saved, and yet we also know that for these AA and HPI men, when they came home, many of them came home to racism, discrimination, hate. To the panel today, now as we look forward to having to engage critically with strategic competition with China, how are we going to learn from the mistakes of the past? And how are we going to better protect and foster a positive environment that will allow us to recruit and retain and take care of the civil rights of our AA and HPI servicemen and civilian personnel?
Ma'am, we want to make sure the environment is inclusive for all of our service members and all those that want to join the service, whether they're AAPI or any racial or ethnic background. You know, my family's a melting pot. I have an aunt that's Chinese. I have cousins that are Chinese. One of my first department heads when I was in the U.S. Navy was Filipino. I had the pleasure of working with many of them throughout, was serving in the United States Navy and in the armed forces. So making sure that they're all treated fairly and everybody is treated fairly is a big thing, and we need to do better at recruiting
I agree
them
we need
and
to do better,
promoting
sir.
them.
My time's about to yield, and I appreciate, yes, I hope you treat every serviceman and woman like it was your family, your friend that you were taking a look in. I can tell you right now, if we have no data to even say whether or not they
woman's
face
time has
discrimination, then we're not taking care of them like we would our own loved ones.
Yield
Thank you.
5
Yield
minutes.
back.
Representative Gates.